I don't know if I'm in favor or against or neutral on the previous changes, but if
Good afternoon. I'd like to call to order the Public Works Finance and Safety Committee meeting of Monday, October 21st, 2019. First item on the agenda is approval of the consent agenda.
So moved.
Have a motion by Lalum and a second by Holeen for approval. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. Motion carries. Item 2 is public input. This is a time set aside for anyone to come forward. Seeing no one, I will move forward. Item number 3 is approval of the agenda.
Make a motion to approve.
A motion by Y and a second by Bueller. Is there any discussion? See none, I'll look for action. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. Motion carries. Item 4 is council consideration of change order number 2, final, with AP & Sons Construction, Inc. for the sanitary sewer improvement project number 1821 for 13th Avenue Southeast for a decrease of $6,650 and a time extension of 258 days. Motion by Lalum. Second by Holeen. And I would like Public Works Director Heath Von Eye to tell us about this.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This item was a project that was initiated in 2018. It is an assessment project, meaning that the costs for this project were assessed back to the adjacent landowners. I believe there were 14 lots assessed in this area, and it's down in the 13th Avenue Southeast area of town. Essentially what this project did, what these funds went towards were to construct a new sanitary sewer lift station. That included some dry well improvements, some furnishing of the lift station and control panels, and some boring work to accommodate the installation. And that project has now been completed. And we, Colin and I, the Assistant City Engineer and myself, have sat down and walked through the timeline on this contract. This one extended well past the contractual substantial completion date, which was set for last September, September 15th of 2018. The project was up and functioning and what we would consider near final completion by December of 2018. So there's about a 3-month lag time in there. The rest of that time was due to, of course, come December, we hit the winter months and had to do a shutdown before they could complete all the grading and seeding and the subsidiary items like that. But we did talk through the timeline with the contractor in relation to the liquidated damages that are outlined in our contracts for not meeting the completion dates. And although we had a big lag from September through December, a good portion of that was due to delayed delivery in some of the mechanical equipment that was ordered. And the contract is specific that delays in delivery are something that the contractor is supposed to be in control of and plan for accordingly. But in this case, I feel the city, we somewhat arbitrarily set our September 15th completion date without knowing the sheer amount of time it was going to take to get some of these components. So we did not hold that time against the contractor. But what we did do is go back and look at the date when he initially ordered this equipment. And it was about 2 weeks, 13 days past the notice of award. So we did feel that that amount of time could have been made up had he executed the ordering of the equipment 13 days prior. So that's where you see a $6,500 calculation for liquidated damages on this contract that's being assessed to the contractor. And we've sat down and met with him and talked through the criteria that we use to come to that number. And although nobody likes to pay liquidated damages on a project, he was amicable to what we came to in relation to how long the project took and when everything was able to get completed by. So that's what we have before the council this evening is a final change order on this project that would reduce it along with the liquidated damages, there's a small nominal amount of as constructed quantities corrected there as well on this final change order. And the net effect being a reduction in $6,650 of the contract.
Okay, thank you. Councilman, any questions or comments about this? None? I would like to just make the comment that this project came about after a request by the owner of the private street for the city to take it over. And so that's kind of what we're working toward. We fully expect that there will be a request to make that private street public. And this was one of the things that we listed that would have to be done, bring the sewer up to standard. So there's a history with this. So don't be surprised when you see that later on. There's still some other things they have to do with the plat and some easements and changes, probably a replat, but we do expect this to come forward as a request to take over.
No right away.
There's, right, it's platted as a private street, and it was platted mostly in conformance with city standards. It has curb and gutter. It's been paved to our standards. It's actually been overlaid, and so this is part of the process. So any other questions or comments? I'll look for action. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. Motion carries. Item 5 is discussion on the city engineer's allowance of the concrete paving of 17th Avenue Southeast and 28th Street Southeast, a Calvin Industrial Park public improvement, foregoing an otherwise required freeze-thaw cycle for asphalt pavement. And this is just a discussion, so I'd like Heath to tell us about it.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to bring this to yours and the council's attention this evening. It's been requested of the city engineering office to allow the paving of the new street that's going to support the Calvin Industrial Park. This street includes a portion of 17th Avenue Southeast, along with, as it curves to the north, a small stretch of 28th Street Southeast. And as you recall, we've gone through some recent platting down in that area and some development agreements and things of that nature to sustain the two industries that are going in down there. The contractor, well, one, first to point out, the developer is the Watertown Development Company, and they are in contract for these improvements out in this area. And the request, the formal request of the city engineering office was to pave this street with concrete pavement yet this fall. And at first glance, I wanted to make sure and read what our regulations said, because I know we had language in there regarding the requirement to go through a freeze-thaw cycle when developing and building any streets in town. Now, I read that regulation, and it is specific to asphalt pavement. And that regulation in our ordinances stipulates that the developer can put down the initial lift of asphalt, and then they're required that to go through a freeze-thaw cycle, and then they're able to put the second lift on no sooner than a year after that first lift has been on. There's some other semantics there that work out, and a lot of times some developers don't put a first lift down, they just let the base go through the freeze-thaw cycle. But in theory, what that does is, it's more than a theory, it's proven. What that does is it brings any weak spots out in the subgrade or the base course or the trenches that were dug for the utility installations. So any of that trench settlement or any of that base or subgrade settlement is observed the next spring, and all those areas can be corrected before we put our new asphalt paving on. Now, fast forward to this request. Our ordinance doesn't contemplate that requirement for concrete paving. So at a minimum, what I had the assistant city engineer do is request that we get some subgrade and base testing done on this area to show what kind of compaction it had, what the material was, what kind of condition it was in. Because I have seen in other communities where if you have thorough testing of the subgrade as it's built and the base course as it's installed and the trench backfill as it's filled in, if you have adequate and thorough testing of those materials, a lot of communities will let the developers move forward with the paving. but it's got to be substantiated by those test results. So the developer, their contractor, they had geotech engineering come up from Sioux Falls, and they performed some geotech testing on this, and their first test showed that the material was not suitable to be paved over yet. And they made recommendations to improve the subgrade and base course, and I believe they had to install some geogrid or geofabric within that pavement section as well. So now they've made those corrections, and they've retested the material, and Geotech has provided a new report that says that the material is now stable to be paved on. So I, as an engineer in the city engineer capacity, am not necessarily concerned about allowing them to pave this fall, but I did want to check it off with the council and the mayor, given the circumstances and our ordinance and how it reads in relation to asphalt paving, and share with you the details that we've gathered in relation to this roadway and the preparation that's gone into it.
All right, thank you. Any questions, council? Councilman Albertson?
Maybe not a question, but maybe a comment. This kind of weather might not be real great for paving also, you know, where it rains and then it kind of dries out, but then it gets wetter, and then, so it might be a good thing to wait anyway.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Councilman Albertson, and that's something that I believe that the contractor's kind of been waiting on and talking with the assistant city engineer about, is the timing of things and whether they could actually get it done. But if they did get a break in the weather and they did have adequate time to re-prep the base course material, that was the plan, to go ahead and get it paved back in yet this fall. We
would probably wait if we had a forecast for freezing conditions over a prolonged period, I would assume. His concrete is damaged by freezing conditions during its curing period. So 7 days, we wouldn't want to have, I mean, it can dip down a little bit. It generates heat. So when it's curing, we wouldn't, you know, if it's going to be down to 20 degrees every night and only getting up to 30 during the day, might not want to do that.
Yeah. One more point of consideration, if I could add to the discussion that I just thought of. It was confirmed that if they can't get concrete down this fall, this isn't to sway your decision, but it's just a matter of fact. The pricing on the concrete was so good this fall that if they can't get it down this fall with concrete, it's likely they're going to switch to asphalt due to pricing next spring. So that's another consideration too, that you know, obviously a concrete street in an industrial park is probably more desirable, less maintenance over the years of its life cycle. And hopefully the weather would give a break to where they could, you know, work the base and make sure it's compacted well to get the thing paved in. But that was another point I wanted to make too.
Thank you. So do we know what is it primarily because of a good price that we were wanting to do this early?
That was my understanding. As far as taking advantage of the good price on the concrete paving and then going ahead and getting it in this fall before any price changes would occur next spring. And Colin Paulson, the assistant city engineer, is here. He's been in these conversations a lot more frequently than I have with the contractor.
Yeah, so partially it is the really good pricing on the concrete, but also what factors in is West Side Implement or East Side Implement here in Watertown now. They do plan on opening early this spring, it sounds like. And with that, they do want the pavement in place. And if it does go to asphalt, this past year, the asphalt plant did not open until June. So, you know, that really complicates things too if they're sitting there with a gravel road waiting on the asphalt plant to open.
Right.
And that's all dependent on weather as well.
Right. All right, thank you. Oh, Councilman Hoyer?
So I guess, like, for me, just with having been around the east side of town quite a bit in my life, this is kind of a lower area, isn't it, anyway? So I guess the concern is, like, if we're already a little bit soft down there and we should do a freeze-thaw cycle, even if we put concrete in, then we're just going to be having to redo the concrete, right? if it doesn't last very long and then it gets full of potholes anyway because we didn't do it right the first time, we're just going to be doing it all over again anyway.
That's why we did the extra testing though, right? We did do testing and made some adjustments after the testing because of the test results.
Right.
Did they put down fabric? Okay. If that's really going to be a big factor in it, is that fabric is going to prevent premature failure of the concrete.
Okay. And then what are the curing temps that concrete should be optimally poured at?
Above freezing.
Yeah.
Just above freezing?
If you don't mind, Mayor.
Go ahead.
To hit on a couple things, our spec actually calls out 40 degrees as the lowest possible pouring degree temp, and 9 degrees is the high. You want to keep concrete within that, otherwise it does cause premature failure a lot of times.
We're beyond that. We're already into the...
Well, correct, but the ground
Freezing
temp and the
temperatures.
forms have to be 40 degrees, not necessarily the air temperature, and that can vary. And that is specifically worded like that in our spec. I just looked at it actually for a different project, but I ran across that one. And then we did require, well, I guess we didn't, but the geotech did request that they take out 14 inches of the subgrade, put in fabric, and 14 inches of base course. That is way larger of a section than we've ever required, especially with concrete on top of it. For example, 2nd Street Northwest going north into River Ridge, that was a 6-inch section of concrete with 8 inches of base and geotextile underneath that. And that road is in very good condition and is about 10 years old now.
Okay, because that's the big thing, is just that it's going to be used industrially, so we're going to have some very large vehicles on it. It's just making sure we really feel good about that as it goes in, because we don't want to be spending millions of dollars fixing this thing in like 5 years.
Right, and the temperature is probably the biggest factor, and I mean we've pushed it to the limits and then regretted it on projects in the past, and we had a annual sidewalk accessibility project that we had to tear a bunch out, and it it looked like it was going to be okay, and the temperature got a little bit colder. The spring came and the concrete crumbled, so we don't want to take that chance because then you're paying twice. So, all right, good discussion. Anything else? We'll move on. Item number 6 is discussion on development agreements, general terms, requirements, and the intent behind their use. And this is a little program that the city engineer, public works directors put together to show you. So Heath, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor. Council, thank you for your time this evening on this discussion. I wanted to take a little bit of time. I believe there was a request some time back for me to touch on this through a presentation to the council, and just due to lack of time, I apologize I haven't gotten to it yet, but there is an agenda item on the regular council meeting a little bit later here this evening regarding the certificate of completion for some subdivision improvements. So I thought this might be a timely coincidence to go ahead and plug this discussion in ahead of that action at the council meeting tonight. So I just wanted to briefly run through our development agreements and how they're used in Watertown and what their function is, and just a few of the details that are incorporated into those agreements. To start the discussion off, I put together this flow chart to kind of give a general idea of the subdivision process. And you can see what I've highlighted here are the several steps, and again, this is a very general layout, I'll remind you. But it's generally speaking the process that we follow when we go through the subdivision process with an applicant, with a developer. And one of the first steps in our ordinances is for them to submit a concept plan to the city. That plan is reviewed by staff and approved by the city engineer. It can be shared with the planning commission for information purposes if we feel it's a large enough one that they may want to look at. But that doesn't ever go to the council level. Then we have the preliminary plan, and that's where the concept plan comments have been reviewed and addressed to make sure that they're taking into account all of our subdivision regulations, all the engineering design standards. The streets are laid out how we want to see them. The utilities are serving all the lots that they're proposed to be platted. And it just dives a little deeper. And this preliminary plan is the one that does end up getting formal approval by the Planning Commission, but again, doesn't come forth to the City Council level. This preliminary plan gets filed, and it more or less it essentially locks the developer in to what it is they're going to be doing in their next several phases. And so it really sets the table for that development. The next step in our process is the construction plans. These are what I would call the civil engineering plans for the public improvements. They issue those to the city engineering office, and we review those against the commonly applied engineering regulations and standards for sanitary sewer design, stormwater systems in their design, and the streets, the curbs and gutter, the pathways, any of those public improvements that may be included in the subdivision. So we receive those civil engineering plans in the engineering office. Colin does a brunt of those reviews for us as the assistant city engineer, and I do a follow-up check on them and help him out as needed with those reviews. And we make comments back to the consultant engineer that's working for the developer and have them address any shortfalls, make any corrections they may need to make, and then we get to an approval point on those. That's kind of where things can diverge in the process. Once a developer has construction plans approved, they have the right to go out and construct them. And we issue a permit of sorts. There's grading permits, and I'd like to formalize this step right here a little bit more than what we do right now, and I haven't done that yet, but issue a formal permit to construct the public improvements. I think we issue a acceptance of the plans letter or something of that nature, but I'd like to issue a formal permit so they have a permit in hand for construction of those public improvements. So the developer has the option to go out and construct those improvements, in which after that point they can have the plat filed. And this part here, that's why I shaded these in green. This part here is kind of the part of the process where the developer can start recouping costs or making money in order to cover their expenses for all these public improvements that they're going to build. What we don't want to happen is them to file this plat without either A, the public improvements being constructed, or B, they've entered into a development agreement with the city that obligates them to build out all the public improvements that are required to service all the lots on their proposed plat. So they have that option at this point, is to either enter into a development agreement or construct the improvements. I'd say 100% of the time, at least in my time here, and I think previous to that, the developers tend to go down this track over here. They enter into the development agreement. We're then able to file the plat, and by our ordinance, we cannot file this plat until one of these two things happen. But once that development agreement is entered into, we can then file a plat, and then they commence with the construction of the improvements as seen on here. And then lot permits, building permits are issued on a per lot basis because lots begin to sell because the plat was filed, and things continue to build out. And then we accept the public improvements and do a warranty and acceptance of those, and everything kind of closes out then at the end. But in a nutshell, we don't want to file a plat without any obligation for these public improvements being performed. And Councilman Bueller.
Sorry, Mayor. If you don't mind, just out of curiosity, where we say construction improvements, if you go down the right side of your chart, would we want to consider saying construction improvement plan and then a plat approval, and then below that maybe have construction improvements? Just a thought, because you're going to have the Planning Commission approve that plat. Do you want to have those things done before the plat is approved? Just a question.
That's a good point, and one of the points on why I think this tract is more commonly taken as well. There's several points on why this side's usually taken, but yeah, if they would want to have some level of assurance that that plat's not going to change when they go out to build those roads. You're exactly right, because if they're out there building the roads and the plat's not approved, or tentatively approved to know that they're on solid ground to build these things in the locations they've shown, that would not be productive at all for anybody. But the reason we require either the construction of these improvements or the development agreement is once they file a plat, they're then able to sell lots. And what we as a city don't want to happen is a developer to be having transactions on lots that are platted with no public improvements in place or no guarantee for those public improvements to be built. Because we then end up with citizens owning lots that either don't have a road, don't have a sewer, and don't have all these necessities that they need to sustain those lots. So that's why our ordinance either requires they be built or they enter into an agreement to build them. But you're exactly right. That's one point on why the option B column here, I'll call it, hardly ever gets used, along with all these little points I put in here. The development timeline is a factor. Cash flow for the developer is another big factor. The sooner they can get this plat filed and the less expense they have up front, the more cash flow they have to start sustaining the cost for those improvements. And then the availability for lots for sale, which obviously helps with that cash flow. So these are all, along with the point that you made, reasons why I think everything tends to gravitate to that option A column here. But the one point I was going to dive into a little bit deeper here is the development agreement. And I'll breeze through a few points here in relation to that. This is just another representation of that. This is a slide I used on a previous discussion that I thought I'd just use once more. You know, the concept plan, prelim plan, construction plans. Then they have to go through the development agreement to get the plat filed, move on to construction, and then we go through the completion and warranty and acceptance phases. Now, the contents of a development agreement, of course, some of the simple things, they have the parties to the agreement and the recitals. It's obviously the city in agreement with somebody, usually a developer or property owner of some nature, sometimes a collective group of owners. And then the cause for the agreement, which is primarily driven by their desire to plat their land. And we need this agreement executed ahead of that, as I discussed previously. Some of the obligations and improvements that are required, that's kind of the brunt of these agreements. And they clearly spell out what public infrastructure is required by the developer. And I wanted to stress this because I think it gets confused with sometimes the private improvements that we don't necessarily include or incorporate or frankly even worry about when it comes to these development agreements. What they're building on their site and some of these industrial parks are outside the realm of the public improvements that we care about that we're going to be taking over for ownership and maintenance. So the public infrastructure is outlined in these development agreements, and it goes into detail about how they're supposed to construct those components. We go into detail in those development agreements regarding the streets. Sometimes they get as specific as talking about the street section, you know, how thick your base course is supposed to be, how thick the paving is supposed to be, the street width and the curb and gutter. Other development agreements that I've seen have been more generalized and they don't get to those level of specifics, but they do just call out the need to perform these improvements meeting the engineering standards as approved on the plans. I'll talk about that difference too in a little bit here on what I envision working more productively as far as what is required in these agreements. Then it talks about sanitary sewer, you know, how to build that out, they're required to build a sewer main and service lines to each lot to meet our city code. Any outstanding sewer assessments from previous sewer construction projects, like maybe a construction of a trunk line, an oversized line that was built to serve this land. Maybe there's outstanding dues owed on that assessment that we would collect at this time as well and stipulate in this agreement. And it also talks about, you know, the need for whether any lift stations are involved in the work. Storm sewer drainage, all the things associated with storm sewer and runoff, the pipes, the inlets, the culverts, the detention ponds, the water quality, BMPs, all those things are spelled out in the agreement. And then coordination with Watertown Municipal Utilities is a critical component of it. They work with the developers and install the electric, natural gas, and water in these subdivisions. This is a unique component that I don't have all the details on, but it is unique in that municipal utilities, I know at least on the water end, are constructing those water main extensions through these subdivisions. And then to my understanding, I think they recoup their costs for that construction through the tap fees that they then assess down the road. But that is most communities, the developers are responsible for installing that water and pay for that up front, just like they would be the sanitary sewer. So that's a neat little nuance to our process that municipal utilities provides that construction, albeit they get it back in tap fees, but other communities will build it and still charge tap fees. So it's a little bit unique component there. Grading and erosion control plans, sidewalks, pathways, and then parkland dedication or a fee in lieu of the parkland dedication are all components of the development agreements. And then it gets into some general provisions. There's a 2-year allowance to complete the required public improvements, and that 2 years is initiated from the date of the filing of the agreement with the plat. It talks about, in the general provisions, the city's power to initiate an assessment of the improvements. So if the developer does not perform the contract duties and the completion is delinquent, or for whatever reason, the city does have the authority and the option to assess those improvements, to hire them done and assess that cost back to that property owner. And then it states in there that the agreement is extended and binding to all the heirs and assigns of the property owner. Yes, Councilman Roby.
On that, go back one chart if you would, please. On that second part, if it is deemed by the city, we have to go back and assess that. We assess the property owner. Does the property owner have any rights to go back to the developer if it wasn't done properly? How does that relationship work out? Who's to decide if it should be the property owner or the developer that pays for it?
That's a very good question. And in this process, there's a little bit of a gap there that I'm personally not real comfortable with, because hopefully it's the developer that still owns the land adjacent to the improvements that you're building out, and then it's clean. You're assessing that cost back onto the developer. But because that plat has been filed, and it's likely they could have sold off some or all the lots, and you're dealing with multiple property owners now that had really no knowledge or involvement in this agreement, it does become a lot more complicated process then. The agreement does carry on to the heirs and assigns, and it's transferred as the property ownership transfers. So I think that Matt would agree that those lot owners would be on the hook for that, but unbeknownst to them, that'd be the case, unless this were vetted through that land transaction when the developer sold that off to that property owner, to the lot buyer. And I don't know if that happens. I really don't. I'm just not involved in that part of the process, obviously. So
The development agreements are recorded against every single lot in a subdivision, though. So when someone buys a lot, that comes up, and it's part of the agreement that they waive their right to protest an assessment. So do they understand it? Maybe not. We've never called anybody on that.
good question. Towards the end of the development agreement, we get into the maintenance and acceptance of the improvements. And this is a fairly straightforward process where once the improvements, the public improvements are complete, the developer's engineer gives us a call up in the city engineering office and asks for us to come and inspect that work. We go out and make what we call a final walkthrough or a final inspection, and we make a list of any defects that we see and call those out to the contractors or the developer's attention to be corrected. And then we bring the certificate of completion forward to the council for their issuance of a certificate of completion. This action initiates then the 1-year warranty. Now, subsequent to that, fast forward a year, we do another year warranty walkthrough. We look for any other deficiencies that may have come up through that year's time, and again make a punch list of correction items as needed. And the developer is supposed to have their contractor address those issues, and then the council has the authority to accept those improvements through a resolution of acceptance. and then they become ours in perpetuity for ownership and maintenance. That's currently how the process works. Now the details on the end here, some communities will accept them right off the bat when they're complete, and then it initiates a 1-year warranty, but they'll have a more robust warranty agreement in place with the developer to ensure that the warranty gets upheld after that year's time. Here, what we're doing is we're delaying the formal acceptance. We're saying, okay, you've completed the work. We're now going to have a 1-year warranty, and then we're going to accept all the improvements for public ownership and maintenance. Now, granted, subsidiary work like snow plowing in that 1 year's time, the city does go out and perform that once the certificate of completion has been issued. And but that's really about the extent of the work that we do as far as any of our involvement within that 1 year's time. So that's our current process as far as the project closeout goes. And in looking ahead, I thought I'd just touch on this here quick as far as our development agreements go and the workflow and the structure and consistency of our process. City engineering obviously plays a big role in this process, and that includes the planning function of the city. The documents that guide the development, which include the subdivision regs, the engineering design standards, the zoning ordinance, are all crucial to keep updated and to make sure that they're staying with the times, so to speak, on what options are out there, what technical criteria we want things built to and designed to, what may be more proficient for the community, what things we may want to consider that are different than what we've required in the past. So the things that are highlighted and bolded here on this screen are things that we've either started to work on or have already made huge accomplishments on in the recent past in making sure that our process is as efficient as it can be, but also provides a safeguard for the community to know that the public improvements that we're accepting are built to the right standards and have gone through a well-vetted process, an efficient and effective well-vetted process. Expanding on the use of the categorization of the application types, the permit forms and the checklists. We've got a lot of permit forms and checklists, and we've continued to polish those and consolidate them as we can and make sure that when something comes into our office, it's categorized appropriately. So if it's something as simple as a plot plan to issue a building permit on a lot that's already been platted, that doesn't take that much review. It's internal between usually the building official, maybe the urban planner, and on rare occasion, the engineering division. But then you expand that to a full-blown subdivision of 80 acres, let's say. Well, that takes a full design review team and involvement with a lot of other city staff. So as we come down the list here, it's important to keep the staff informed and the applicants informed of what the review process is, what it entails, what each type of application, what conduit that application will go down as far as the series of processes it has to follow. And I think the more we can educate our internal staff and the applicants on this, the better this process will become for the development throughout the community. Everybody begins to know the process and understand it, and they know what to expect for when they come into the door up at second floor City Hall. This is one process right here, just the Public Works restructuring. I wanted to touch on this. Building Services, the building official is the zoning administrator of our city code, and he issues all the building permits and administers all the building regulations. Engineering, the city engineer, is the planning administrator of our city code. And in that hat that I wear, I'm responsible to administer the subdivision regs with my staff and also the design standards that we're currently working on. Now, prior to the Public Works restructuring, they were kind of two separate silos, if you will, where you had planning over here under engineering and then zoning over here under building services. But now that we're both under Public Works, it becomes, I don't want to call it a forced partnership, but it really has. It's become a forced partnership that's natural. You commonly see planning and zoning as a joint function of any municipality, and we were although we worked together, the staff knew who to go to. There weren't any quarrels that way at all, but they were separated just by the way they were structured. And so we made improvements that way, I believe, just by going to the public works structure. The design review team, the calendar on a regular meeting cycle that eventually we hope to incorporate the applicant, the developer. We would like them to invite them to the table with the design review team and talk about our comments on their plans for their subdivision. And that's something that I've exercised at a previous community, and something that we've learned recently that Brookings has incorporated in their development plan review process. And I've seen that work really well, where you get the developer at the table with the design review team, and it results in a very productive process to get them on the same page with what's being expected of them. And then as we wrap it up here, as far as looking ahead on the development agreement itself, one of the things I touched on earlier that I wanted to hit on here in the closing is wanting to make sure that we're as proficient with these agreements as we can be. And what I mean by that is sometimes, as I referenced earlier, I would see where we would actually get a specific to call out the thickness of asphalt to be paved in a development agreement. Well, sometimes when we get that specific on the technical details, it can contradict what was approved in the construction plans if we're not careful, if we're not making sure that they both match. And so in order to eliminate some of those potential discrepancies, I like to see sometimes some more general terms outlined in these development agreements that don't get quite that specific to talk about the actual thickness of pavement. Because if we say you need 4 inches and for some reason the construction plans were approved showed 5 inches, right off the bat we're dealing with discrepancies and confusion on the project. And you'll find that, I was looking at Harrisburg's, for example. They have a very similar development agreement as we do, and theirs is fairly generally spoken, written out as well. And a lot of times it defers back to those regulations that we're using to approve the construction plans. It refers back to the subdivision regulations. It defers back to the engineering design standards. And it leaves all the technical jargon out of the agreement, but still in the realm of the permit that they get to construct the public improvements. Aside from that, that is the end of the slideshow. I did have a closing slide there, but there it is. Councilman,
Thank you, Heath.
Councilman Vilhauer.
Just a comment. I commend you for taking this on, Heath. And your previous slide, the communication and education is so critical. I know a number of us have sat through uncomfortable meetings in the past where applicants or the developers didn't know that something was supposed to be done yet, and why weren't we notified? And I guess I just like what I'm hearing as far as streamlining, educating, using checklists, whatever. So we don't have some of those issues that come up after the fact, and let's get out ahead of it and get the job done right to begin with.
Right, and one thing that Heath probably doesn't know because he's new here, but I watched these development agreements grow and change. We didn't used to have an approved construction plan on file, which I know you're doing, which is excellent. I'm very happy about that. But if you don't have an approved plan, how do you know what you're supposed to build? That's why that language was put in the development agreement, that we're going to do 4 inches of asphalt, because we don't have a approved plan.
That makes sense.
So, and we're going to do 38 feet wide. Well, if you have an approved plan, that is all in the approved plan.
Yeah.
You can just say, build it per the approved plan.
Exactly.
And take out 3 of the 6 pages. Councilman Hoyer?
I'm just going to kind of echo a little bit of what Councilman Vilhauer said. Yeah, sorry. Long day. But as long as we're taking that language and we're just referencing our actual ordinances and our actual standards, then like 100% doesn't need to be said twice. So I think streamlining that is great. And then just so long as we're following up and ensuring that it's all followed, because that does put a little bit of the burden on the developer to actually understand. And I know the education part of it will help with that, but I just know, especially with our road standards, that's probably why that's the example that popped up in an actual agreement where they outlined it, because we have such interesting terrain to work with sometimes, but good to use the ordinances directly and our requirements, so.
Right, and some cities do not allow a plat to be recorded until the physical improvements have been completed and accepted. And that actually is reflected in our ordinance language. Aside from doing that, you have to do a development agreement, or you have to build the stuff. So you'd have a plat approved, but not recorded. And you can't sell lots until the plat is recorded, and you won't record the plat until either the improvements are done and approved, or development agreement has been approved by the city council to be recorded along with the plat, so that it's very clear who's building what and when. And a lot of cities require bonding with a development agreement, and that's, I think we're probably one of the only cities around that doesn't do that. So then if they don't build it, you wouldn't necessarily have to assess it. You'd use the bond that the developer put forward. Then you're not leaving those property owners who've bought a lot and didn't even realize that that 6-page development agreement said they might be responsible for building the road. You've got the bond to build the road. So something we may want to consider in the future.
And actually, Mayor, I think your point there helped clarify Councilman Bueller's question earlier that I hadn't thought of, where you would have the plat approved, we would just hold off the filing of it until those improvements were constructed, and which is right along the lines of what Councilman Bueller was questioning. Because.
Yep. Any other questions, or Councilman Lallam?
Took us a minute to get there, but we got there, Bruce.
Heath, on that, you want to have formalized engineer approval under your construction plans? Is that what you'd like to see? Your
Yes.
Associated permits?
That is already part of our code, our ordinance. Ordinance requires those construction plans be submitted to the engineering office and approved by the city engineer. What we're not doing, and Colin could chime in on this too, but I've thrown this idea out, and I don't know if he's doing it yet or not, but issuing a formal permit once we approve that design. I think in the past we've been issuing a letter of acceptance of the plans or something of that nature. The mayor would know more on this than I would too.
We actually haven't.
You haven't even done that?
No, and part of the reason is because they're designing on the fly and everybody's always in a hurry, and they're not quite done with the construction plans. So we get the development agreement, and it says in there they're going to build this certain thing, 4 inches of asphalt, 9 inches of base, 38 feet wide, whatever. That's all spelled out, and the construction agreement or the construction plans have come to us in pieces, and that's really not a great way to go about it. It's better the way you have it mapped out.
Yeah, and I don't know, Councilman Lallam, if that answered your question or where you were going with that, but.
Well, I personally like to see a permit issued on that. That's, that you guys have followed through on all of the requirements that our ordinance speaks to, as well as this is what has been delved to us from the developer that says this is what it's going to be, and then a permit be associated with that. And the other thing I would like to see is, during the construct improvements, be inspection of said such improvements as we go type of deal.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see an actual checklist with that, once the base course is set. Once the, first grade's done, base course is set. If we're putting mesh down, then we inspected the mesh.
Yeah.
All those in there so that each time we can check that off, and that should actually take care of Michael's point that we're not going back 5 years later when we could go back 25 years later.
Yeah. That brings up a good point that I wanted to raise too, that step, the issuance of a formal permit, I mean, it's just a single sheet of paper that our office would administer, but I never look at those things as an egregious extra layer of red tape. To me, if I were a developer, I would want that in my hand to have something on file for my records that says this is what the city approved for me to build. And I think we've all ran across examples in the recent past where that didn't happen, and that created a lot of confusion down the road where plans changed and different things got constructed differently than what was expected, and then the developers having to go back and spend more money on redesign and reconstruction, And so I think it's not only a safeguard for the city to say, hey, we're going to check this off, or we're going to say that your review is complete, your plans are approved, but it's also a safeguard for that developer to have something in their files that shows what was approved for them to construct and what they were held responsible to construct.
I think that's their fallback approach too, that, hey, look, this is what you guys said I need to follow. I mean, not just a safeguard, but they're like, if you're changing your thing as we go forward, you know, maybe the ordinance gets changed or something along those lines where we decide, well, instead of 6, we need 8. You know, something along those lines. There's like, well, look, we have this as to what it was that day, and this is what we built off of. So not just a safeguard, but it's a way that we can formalize it and say, that I met all the requirements that you guys set forward. You know, if you change that, that's not a me at that point. So it's not just for us, but it gives us something to say, you did not do what you're supposed to based on the guidelines you gave to us. So, I mean, it's a give and take for both sides, and neither one of us have to say, well, he said this, he said that. No, this is what it is, this is approved, this is what you built to, we're good. So I'd like to see it, like I said, for me personally, it's more as they're building that we're following up on it to make sure that it's done correctly.
And I'm just going to chime in a little bit here because there are some council members here that we recently went through this, and I know, Adam, you were not in that room. Excuse me. You know, we do have a lot of procedures and policies that we need to iron out. Some have been on the books and they just haven't been followed. There's been a lot of change since Heath has came, and almost all of it's been excellent for our department and our city. We're good. And, you know, I want to kind of applaud his efforts because I know it's been quite the undertaking since he's been here. Luckily, we have a pretty young staff. We have an accepting staff of these changes, and we are trying to implement more a formal process. I know it was hit or miss since I've been here, whether we issued something or not for acceptance. I've been trying to be diligent about doing that because I know what we went through recently. And I just, you know, we're trying to improve that. And I think with our some of the proposed improvements that Heath is doing and we're working on as on the staff level, I think we're going in the right direction. And I think we're going to improve it quite a bit going forward here.
Well, I think it helps our developers as well because they know, here's the checklist.
Right.
It's, you know, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, maybe it's 20 or whatever it is, but okay, yeah, 1 through 5 are done. 6 is not done. We need to get that done. You know, maybe they call you and say, hey, I'm waiting on you guys to come out and take a look at this. Let's get this done. So it's a way for them to follow the same guidelines, same checklist. So I mean, it's a little bit of potentially additional work for your guys' office, but it also gives you the wherewithal to say, okay, yeah, you didn't follow our directions, or maybe we didn't follow our directions. So it's for the developers as well. Gives them an opportunity to say, you know, you're telling us what we need. Let's get it checked off on that side too.
Yep. All right. Any other, Councilman Hoyer?
Just to kind of toss some more real world on this too. I mean, we went through this earlier in the summer when we were talking about sump pumps. We had a developer who said, you know, I didn't ever realize that there was that much of a distance you're supposed to have on the foundation. We would just dig the hole, and if it didn't have water in it after 2 weeks, then we'd call it good. So I really like the idea of us doing a checklist and going out and just verifying that stuff, because it not only, as it's been said, safeguards us, safeguards the developer, but it also looks after the hard work that people put into it. It looks after the homeowners. It looks after our roads. Just, I think we could really tighten our shot group on this if we start implementing some of these simple fixes.
Yep.
But you guys are doing outstanding work. So, thank you.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.
Next item on the agenda is old business. Is there any old business? Any new business? I don't see any. Item 9 is executive session pursuant to SDCL 1-25-2, and we will need to go into executive session in order to discuss and consult with legal counsel on contractual matters. We do not expect to take any action upon coming out. So I have a motion by Vilhauer and a second by Lallam to go into executive session. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. Motion carries. We are in executive session.